Hey there, welcome to Mr. Cozy True Crime Stories. Tonight, we're diving into 2 hours of gripping true crime cases. Real stories of mystery, betrayal, and cold-blooded crimes, all set against the soothing backdrop of rain. It's the perfect blend of calm and unsettling. If these cases draw you in, tap that like button, share with your fellow true crime lovers, and subscribe to join our curious community. I'm always wondering, where are you tuning in from? And what time is it for you right now? Drop it in the comments below. Now settle in, and let's dig into the darkness. Story 1. The town of Paradise, Texas, is the kind of place whose name sounds like a promise. A small, unhurried community in Wise County, northwest of Fort Worth, where the land is wide and flat, and the sky at sunset turns the color of warm copper. It is farm country, honest country, the kind of place where children are free to run across yards and families know their neighbors' faces. People come to towns like Paradise looking for exactly what the name suggests. A quieter life, a little space, a measure of safety from the crowded and complicated world beyond the county line. On the evening of November 30th, 2022, in a home on the rural outskirts of this small town, a 7-year-old girl named Athena Presley Monroe Strand went to her bedroom to put away laundry. It was a Wednesday. The air was cool, the way North Texas evenings turned sharply cold in late autumn, and the family's house was in the middle of construction, work being done to expand and improve the home where Athena lived with her father and his wife. Because of that ongoing renovation, Athena and her stepsister had been sleeping in a converted storage shed that sat on the property beside the main house. It was a makeshift arrangement, the kind a family manages through during a renovation, fully intending to be back inside permanent walls before long. Athena walked out to that shed. She did not come back. By the time the sun had set completely and the evening had settled over Wise County, the little girl with the bright spirit and the full name, Athena Presley Monroe Strand, had been taken from the only world she had ever known, by a man she had never met, in the darkest and most irrevocable way that one human being can end another's life. She was 7 years old. Athena's mother, Maitland Gandy, lived across the state line in southern Oklahoma. She held sole custody of her daughter, and for most of Athena's young life, the little girl had been at her mother's side. Maitland would describe her daughter in the only terms that truly capture a child who has not yet been defined by the world. She called her a fighter. A girl with a personality that filled whatever space she occupied. Bright, loving, the kind of child who leaves an impression on every adult she meets. Not through any extraordinary accomplishment, but simply through the force of being so fully, warmly herself. In the spring of 2022, Maitland became ill. In the practical reorganization that illness forces upon a family, it was decided that Athena would spend the fall semester in Texas with her father and his wife, Elizabeth Strand. It was not a permanent change, just a seasonal arrangement, a way of ensuring Athena was cared for and stable while her mother recovered. Athena moved to Paradise in May of that year, settling into a new school, a new bedroom, a new daily rhythm. She adapted, the way children do, with a resilience that adults often envy. The construction on the house began, and Athena and her stepsister moved into the converted storage shed on the property. It was arranged as a real room, not comfortable exactly, but functional, with enough space for 2 girls to sleep and keep their things. Athena was doing laundry the evening she disappeared. She had been given a chore, the ordinary domestic responsibility of a 7-year-old learning to help around the house. Earlier that evening, she and her stepmother had a disagreement. Nothing unusual, nothing that any child and any step-parent do not navigate in the normal friction of a blended family. Afterward, Athena went to the shed. At 6:41 in the evening, Elizabeth Strand called 911. She had looked for Athena first, had searched the property, had called her name, had walked the yard, before reaching for the phone. When she told the dispatcher that her daughter was missing, she said Athena had last been seen heading toward the shed at approximately 5:30 in the afternoon. The 911 call set the machinery of a search in motion with extraordinary speed. Within hours, every available resource that Wise County, the state of Texas, and the federal government could provide was converging on the town of Paradise. Texas Rangers arrived. The FBI deployed. Fort Worth Police, Highway Patrol, and game wardens all joined the effort. Wise County Sheriff Lane Akin, who had been in Llano when the call came in, drove back immediately when Athena had not been found within a 2-hour window. He understood, as every experienced law enforcement officer understands in the first hours of a child disappearance case, that time is not a neutral variable. Every hour that passes is not simply an hour lost. It is a diminishing probability. The community responded in a way that would move hardened investigators. By the following morning, December 1st, approximately 300 people had registered with emergency management to join the formal search effort. Ordinary citizens who brought their own dogs, their own four-wheelers, their own flashlights, their own willingness to walk the cold Texas earth in the dark on behalf of a 7-year-old girl they had never met. They searched shoulder to shoulder, covering the land around the Strand property, fanning outward from the family's driveway through the fields and scrub and creek beds of Wise County. A command center was established at the fire station near the family's home. It became the nerve center of a search that involved, simultaneously, hundreds of volunteers on the ground and a parallel, digital investigation unfolding in front of computer screens miles away. That digital investigation would crack the case in less than 24 hours. In the early hours of the search, investigators began reviewing every piece of activity that had occurred on and around the Strand property on the evening of November 30th. Package deliveries stood out immediately. A FedEx contract driver had made a delivery to the Strand home that evening, a delivery that records showed had been completed in the precise window of time surrounding Athena's disappearance. What made this detail remarkable, what transformed it from a logistical entry into the center of the entire investigation, was the nature of the package itself. The delivery that had been dropped at the Strand home that evening was a Christmas present addressed to Athena. The last thing delivered to that address before a little girl vanished was a gift intended for her. The driver's name was Tanner Lynn Horner. He was 25 years old at the time, a contract delivery driver working on behalf of FedEx, covering the rural routes of Wise County in a delivery van. Investigators moved quickly, working through the digital trail that modern delivery infrastructure leaves behind. GPS records, route data, cellular ping data, package scan logs. The data placed Horner at the Strand property during the critical window. When law enforcement made contact with Horner, the confrontation was relatively brief. He did not deny being at the property. He did not deny knowing where Athena was. He confessed. The story he told was this. He had been completing his delivery at the Strand home when he backed up his van and accidentally struck Athena, who had been nearby. He said the collision had not appeared to seriously injure her. But then, he claimed, panic overtook him. He said he was afraid that she would tell her father what had happened, that he would lose his job, that there would be consequences, and so he made the decision to take her. He placed her in the back of the delivery van and drove away from the Strand property with a 7-year-old girl in his vehicle. What happened next, in the back of that van on the rural roads of Wise County, was the darkest part of what an already devastating case would reveal. Horner told investigators that when he attempted to break Athena's neck, it did not work. He then used both hands to strangle her. Wise County Sheriff Lane Akin stood before the press on the evening of December 2nd, 2022, and delivered the words that no community ever wants to hear about a child who has been missing. Athena's body had been found southeast of Boyd, Texas, approximately 9 miles from her home, at a place called Bobo's Crossing near the Trinity River. She was face down in the water. Horner had led police to her. The Amber Alert that had gone out for Athena after she was reported missing had reached millions of phones across North Texas. People in restaurants and grocery stores and living rooms had looked down at the alert on their screens and felt the particular stab of dread that such messages carry. A child's face, a child's name, a child's last known location, and the implicit understanding that every second between the alert and its resolution carries irreversible weight. For those millions of people, the resolution came in the most devastating form it could take. For Maitland Gandy in southern Oklahoma, the resolution came the way it always comes for a parent in this situation, as a phone call that divides life into a before and an after. For the 300 people who had walked the fields of Wise County in the cold, their breath clouding the morning air as they called a little girl's name. for the K-9 units and the Texas Rangers, and the sheriff who had driven back from Llano, and the game wardens, and the neighbors who had brought their four-wheelers out without being asked. The resolution came as the news that everything they had feared from the first hour was true. Athena Presley Monroe Strand had been gone within an hour of stepping outside. By the time her stepmother had called 911, by the time the first deputy had arrived, by the time the command center had been established at the fire station, and the search grid had been drawn up, and the volunteers had begun to arrive with their dogs and their flashlights, the little girl had already been killed. The search, for all its scale and sincerity and human determination, had been a search for the truth about what had already happened, not a race to prevent what might. Tanner Horner was arrested on the evening of December 2nd, 2022, as Athena's body was being recovered from the Trinity River. He was charged with capital murder of a person under 10 years old and aggravated kidnapping, two of the most serious charges that the state of Texas can bring against an individual. He was booked into the Wise County Jail. In the days after his arrest, in a recorded jail call with his mother that would later be played for a jury, Horner's mother asked him a question through the phone line. Her voice carried the specific, exhausted grief of a parent who knows something terrible has been done and needs to understand the full dimension of it. She said she hoped he had not done anything weird to the little girl. Horner said he had not. The DNA evidence that forensic analyst Jacqueline Ferrara would present to a jury more than 3 years later told a different story. Male DNA had been detected on Athena's body. Blood and other biological material were found on multiple items of Horner's clothing, including his FedEx work shirt. The trial of Tanner Lynn Horner was scheduled to begin on April 7, 2026, 3 years, 4 months, and 7 days after Athena Strand had walked toward her bedroom on a cool Texas evening and never returned. On the morning of April 7th, as the jury took its seats and the courtroom settled into the weighty silence that precedes the beginning of a capital proceeding, Tanner Horner did something no one had publicly anticipated. He pleaded guilty. Guilty to capital murder. Guilty to aggravated kidnapping. Wise County District Attorney James Stainton stood before the jury in the opening statements that followed the guilty plea and delivered what is perhaps the most efficient and devastating summary of a defendant's confession in recent Texas legal history. The only truthful thing that Tanner Horner told law enforcement was that he killed her. The story about the accidental collision with the van, prosecutors told the jury, was a lie. The framing of panic, of an impulsive decision, of a man overwhelmed by the sudden fear of consequences, all of it had been constructed after the fact, a narrative designed to reduce the appearance of premeditation, to make the inexcusable appear, at minimum, partially explicable. The prosecution laid out what they believed had actually occurred, that this had not been a man who had stumbled into a moment of terrible decision-making, but a man whose actions that evening were driven by intent far darker than a fear of losing his job. The digital evidence they had gathered, including the fact that Horner, after the crime, had searched on his phone for the phrase, "Do FedEx truck cameras constantly record?" painted a portrait of a person thinking, calculating, assessing his exposure. A man genuinely overcome by panic does not pause to conduct surveillance research. Because Horner had pleaded guilty, the trial moved immediately into the punishment phase, the proceeding in which a jury must weigh every fact, every expert opinion, every piece of testimony, and every human detail to determine whether Tanner Horner will die by lethal injection or spend the remainder of his natural life inside a Texas prison. Over the days that followed, the courtroom in Tarrant County became a space where the full human cost of a single evening was measured out in testimony. 62 witnesses were called across the proceeding. The stepmother took the stand, her voice breaking, and described the moment she realized Athena was gone. The walk to the shed, the finding of nothing, the hour of searching the property alone before she called 911, the terror of the phone call, the arrival of deputies, the overnight search that turned the quiet roads of paradise into something unrecognizable. She described learning that Athena was dead. She described what that knowledge does to a person, how it settles into the body and the life, and becomes a permanent feature of every morning that follows. Dr. Jessica Dwyer, the chief medical examiner, took the stand and presented the autopsy findings with the clinical precision that her role demands and the human weight that no clinical precision can fully contain. Athena's body had shown signs of trauma. The cause of death was strangulation. Letters Horner had written from jail prior to a suicide attempt were shown to the jury. One was addressed to Athena's family. In it, he apologized for killing their daughter. He also disclosed in the letter that he had been diagnosed with Asperger's syndrome, a detail the defense would use in arguing for life in prison rather than execution, pointing to his developmental and psychological history as mitigating factors that the jury should weigh. On April 14, 2026, Maitland Gandhi walked into the courtroom and took the stand to face the man who had killed her daughter. She had raised Athena, had held her through the years, had watched her become a 7-year-old full of the particular energy and wonder that children carry before the world has had time to diminish it. She had allowed her daughter to spend a semester in Texas so that she could rest and recover from illness. A decision made from the simple, practical love of a mother trying to do what was best for her child. She had received a phone call on November 30th that no phone call should ever have to deliver. "I am her voice," Maitland said from the stand. Those 4 words carried the full weight of what the prosecution, the search volunteers, the investigators, the forensic analysts, and every witness who had spoken that week had been trying to convey. A 7-year-old girl cannot testify. She cannot describe what happened to her in the back of a delivery van on the evening she went to put away her laundry. She cannot tell a jury what she felt or thought or said. She cannot ask for anything. She is gone, and the only voices that remain to speak for her are those of the people who loved her, and the physical evidence that her body and the technology of a delivery route left behind. I am her voice. 3 years, 4 months, and 14 days after Athena Strand had stepped outside on an ordinary Wednesday evening in Paradise, Texas, her mother sat in a courtroom and became the instrument through which a dead 7-year-old could speak. She talked about what Athena had been, the brightness, the fullness, the fighter quality that her mother had seen from the beginning. She talked about what had been taken. She talked about the family that had been permanently altered by a single act of violence on a November evening that began with a FedEx van delivering a Christmas present and ended at a river crossing 9 miles from home. The punishment phase of the trial continued into April 2026, with the jury weighing every piece of testimony, every exhibit, every strand of digital evidence against the question that capital proceedings in Texas require 12 ordinary citizens to answer together. Does this man live, or does this man die? What is not waiting, what has already been answered, is the question of guilt. Tanner Lynn Horner looked at a jury of his peers on the first morning of his trial and admitted, in the formal language of a guilty plea, that he kidnapped and murdered a 7-year-old girl who had been placed in the temporary care of a family that loved her in a town named Paradise on a Wednesday evening in late November. He admitted it because there was nothing else left to say. The GPS records said it. The cell phone data said it. The biological evidence said it. The unfinished laundry in a converted storage shed said it. Athena had been carrying clothes to put away. She had stepped outside into a cool Texas evening, her whole small life still in front of her. She had been 7 years old enough to have a favorite color, a best friend, a way of laughing, a particular way of asking for what she wanted. Old enough to feel the specific happiness of knowing a Christmas present had arrived with her name on it. Old enough to be a daughter, a stepsister, a granddaughter, a girl who had moved from Oklahoma to Texas for a semester and who was like any child in any family at any moment, simply trying to navigate the space between the people who loved her. She had walked outside, and she had not come back, and 300 people had walked the fields of Wise County calling her name because they could not bear to stop. And in a courtroom in Fort Worth years later, her mother stood up and said the only thing a mother can say when language has been made insufficient by grief, and the only thing that truly matters when a child has been taken from the world. I am her voice. Story 2. The town of Athol, Idaho, sits quietly in the northern reaches of the Panhandle State, a small, unhurried place where the air carries the scent of pine and the roads stretch long and straight toward the mountains. It is the kind of town where people leave their doors unlocked without a second thought, where a person's word still counts for something, and where a woman who had lived honestly and warmly for 48 years could reasonably expect to grow old among the people she loved. 10 acres of land outside of Athol was the home that Kendi Howard had shared with her husband for more than 2 decades. A property where horses had grazed, where a goat had wandered the yard, where a son had grown into a man, and where the ordinary, complicated machinery of a long marriage had turned day after day, year after year. On the night of February 2nd, 2021, something in that house was silenced forever. At 10:43 in the evening, a 911 dispatcher received a call. The voice on the line was frantic, rising and cracking, barely coherent. The caller was Dan Howard, Kendi's husband, a former Idaho State Police trooper. He was screaming. He said his wife was in the bathtub. He said she was dead. He said she had shot herself. The call was dispatched as a suicide. But even in those first chaotic minutes, before any investigator had crossed the threshold of the Howard home, something about the story felt incomplete. It would take more than 2 years to understand exactly why. 2 years of forensic work, painstaking interviews, and the patient piecing together of evidence that a man trained in law enforcement had believed would never be found. Kendi Howard was, by every account, the kind of person who made a room feel warmer simply by being in it. She had grown up in Camilla, a small town in central Idaho, a girl shaped by the landscape around her, sporty and outdoorsy, the sort of young woman who was as comfortable on horseback as she was in conversation with a stranger. Her brother Brian described her as someone who rode her horse with easy joy, who kept sheep and a goat on their family land, and who had the specific gift of making anyone she met feel genuinely seen. Her obituary would later describe her bubbly personality and her ability to make everyone feel as if they were her friend. She was 22 years old when she married Dan Howard, a former United States Marine who had transitioned into the uniform of an Idaho State Police trooper. He was 6 years older, broad-shouldered and disciplined, and she was drawn, her family later noted, to his confidence and the sense of security he radiated. They settled on their 10-acre property in Athol, 21 miles north of Coeur d'Alene. Their son Wyatt was born, grew up, and eventually followed his father's path into the Marines. Kendi found work at a local medical center. Together, the Howards built a life that, from the outside, carried the steady appearance of stability. Neighbors described the marriage as strong. They seemed affectionate toward each other, respectful. For years, the family occupied the easy surface of what a long marriage is supposed to look like. The shared routines, the comfortable silences, the accumulated rituals of 2 people who had built something together and intended, or appeared to intend, to continue building it. But beneath that surface, something far darker had been growing for a very long time. The first serious warning had come roughly a decade before Kendi's death. Dan Howard had become convinced, at some point during those years, that his wife was involved with another man. The way he responded to that belief was not the behavior of a man who processed jealousy with restraint. He was accused of stalking the man he suspected of the affair, following him, monitoring him, pouring syrup into the engines of his vehicles to destroy them. He allegedly stole the man's mail, and one night, he fired a gun at the man's house. He had also reportedly made a comment, casually and in company, that he could understand why men killed their wives. It was the kind of remark that most people brush aside in the moment, the throwaway aggression of a man blowing off steam, but which, in retrospect, judges and prosecutors and ordinary citizens would come to hear differently. Despite everything, the marriage continued. Another decade passed, and then, in the final weeks of her life, Kendi Howard had begun quietly, carefully, making a different plan. She had started working with a real estate agent, a man who was helping her find a new house near her hometown of Camilla, the place where her parents still lived, the place where she had grown up and had friends who remembered her as a girl. She was buying a way out. She had not left yet, had not formally ended the marriage, had not stood in front of Dan Howard and said the words he had always feared hearing. But the documents were being signed. The distance was being measured. And Dan Howard had found out. 4 nights before she died, Kendi's mother called the Kootenai County Sheriff's Office. She had spoken to her daughter on the phone, and what she heard in Kendi's voice, the pitch, the breathlessness, the quality of fear that a mother cannot mistake, had frightened her badly enough to call for a welfare check at the Howard property. The deputy who responded drove to the Athol home and knocked. Kendi answered the door. She was visibly nervous, her body language tightly controlled in the way of a person who has become practiced at concealment. The deputy's body camera captured the exchange. Kendi's voice was careful, measured, as she spoke about what had happened. She described waking in the early hours of January 29, 2021, to find Dan Howard standing over her in the dark bedroom. He was wearing dark clothing. He had on black latex gloves. He was holding a pillow in both hands. She said the look in his eyes was one she had never seen before. She told the deputy and later her friends that in that moment, lying in the dark, looking up at the man she had been married to for more than 25 years, she had believed with absolute certainty that he was going to kill her. She had not, however, reported formal physical abuse to the deputy. Without that explicit statement from the victim, the deputy could not arrest Dan Howard. The welfare check ended with Kendi leaving the house, gathering herself and walking out the door, but without charges, without protection, and without any legal barrier between her and the man she had looked at that night with such terror. The deputy drove away, and the clock, though no one knew it yet, had begun its final count. In the days that followed, Kendi spoke to her friends. One evening, a few nights before February 2nd, she went out with a group of women who knew her well. She was crying. She said, through her tears, "I don't even deserve to be here." That she believed Kendi had taken her own life. Heard something in those words that she read as despair, as a woman who had lost her footing on the ground of her own life. But others who knew Kendi heard something different. They heard a woman who was frightened, who was cornered, who was reaching toward the people around her in the only way she could without setting off the man who was watching her, who had always watched her, who had found out about the real estate agent and the house near Camilla and the life she was planning to live without him. The night of February 2nd began, according to Dan Howard, in unremarkable domestic fashion. He told police he had been downstairs at a desk, attending to paperwork, signing documents, managing the kind of routine financial business that fills the evenings of ordinary households. Kendi was upstairs. After some time, Dan said it was over an hour, he heard a noise from somewhere above him. He went upstairs. He found her in the bathtub, filled with water. She was nude. The gun, her own pistol, was at the bottom of the tub in murky, discolored water. There was a wound to her head. He called 911 at 10:43 p.m., screaming, his voice collapsing into fragments. He said she was dead. He said she had shot herself. He said it the way a husband might say it who had just discovered the unthinkable, the raw, animal noise of shock. But when Kootenai County Sheriff's Detective Jerry Northrup arrived at the Howard home before midnight, he found himself looking at a scene that sent a quiet, professional alarm moving through him. Something was missing. Northrup was a crime scene expert. He had spent years processing scenes of violence, learning the physical grammar of death, what it looks like, how a body falls, what a real trauma leaves behind in blood and evidence. He noted immediately that for a woman who had sustained a gunshot wound to the head while immersed in a bathtub, there was a striking absence of blood spatter. The amount of blood present in that bathroom and on those walls was inconsistent with what a living, breathing body produces when it is shot. The gun's position at the bottom of the tub struck him as unusual. The angle of the wound was unusual. The fact that Kendi was nude in the bathtub, filled with water, in the specific circumstances described, all of it sat, in Northrup's experienced mind, at an angle that did not quite align with the story of a woman who had chosen this place and this moment for herself. And then came the detail that would later become one of the most quietly powerful pieces of evidence in the entire case. The dryer. Somewhere in the house, a laundry cycle was running, and it had not finished. It was a small, mundane, entirely human thing. Investigators asked themselves what it meant that a woman who had, according to her husband, deliberately planned to end her life had left a load of laundry unfinished in the dryer. It was a detail that a practiced detective could not release from his mind, the kind of domestic fact that sits very poorly alongside the theory of premeditated suicide. When forensic technicians and medical examiners completed a full examination of Kendi Howard's body, the findings expanded in horrifying dimension. Her body was covered in bruises from head to toe. Not old bruises, but fresh ones, the physical testimony of a severe and recent assault. She had shallow cuts on the soles of her feet. A large second-degree burn was visible on her skin, and her jaw had been broken. The wound itself, when analyzed by forensic pathologist Dr. Rambaran, told a story that no amount of staging could fully erase. The bullet had entered through the back of her mouth, traveled downward through her tongue, nearly severing it, and lodged behind her spine after shattering the C2 vertebra. The trajectory was downward. For Kendi Howard to have fired that shot herself, while sitting in a bathtub, the physics of her arm, her hand, the angle of the barrel, and the direction of the bullet would have required a configuration that was medically and anatomically impossible. She could not have fired that shot. The gun in the tub, the scene arranged with such apparent deliberateness. It had been put there. The whole picture had been constructed by someone who understood crime scenes from the inside out to look like something it was not. Investigators turned their attention to what Dan Howard knew, not who he was as a husband or a neighbor, but what he had been trained to do as a law enforcement officer. The theory that prosecutors assembled piece by careful piece over more than 2 years of investigation was this. On the night of February 2nd, 2021, Dan Howard and Kendi Howard had a confrontation that turned violent. They argued about money, about the finances of a marriage that was coming apart, about a house near Camilla that his wife was buying with another man's professional help, about the dissolution of something Dan Howard had spent 26 years believing he owned. He beat her. He broke her jaw. He strangled her using the hold he had been trained to administer precisely and lethally. He rendered her unconscious and then dead. And then, because he had spent years in law enforcement, because he had stood inside crime scenes and understood how detectives read them, he carried Kendi's body to the bathtub, drew the water, placed her gun in her hand, and fired a shot into the back of her mouth to turn a murder into the appearance of a suicide. He had, prosecutors believed, used everything his career had taught him to try to escape the consequences of what he had done. The 2 years that followed the death were a long, grinding exercise in forensic patience. Investigators worked without a confession, without an eyewitness, without DNA evidence linking Dan Howard directly to Kendi's weapon. What they had was the body itself, its bruises, its broken bones, its burns, and the impossible angle of a bullet, and the growing body of testimony from the people who had known Kendi in the final weeks of her life. They had the welfare check from 4 nights before her death. They had the body camera footage of a frightened woman describing a man standing over her in the dark with a pillow and black latex gloves. In April 2023, the Kootenai County Sheriff's Office announced that Dan Howard had been charged with murder in the 2nd degree and domestic battery. The domestic battery charge stemmed from an incident 7 months before Kendi's death, when she had photographed her bruises and sent the images to her friend Michelle Lampert. A quiet act of documentation by a woman who was living inside fear and had, perhaps, begun to understand that she might need evidence of what was happening to her. Dan Howard surrendered himself to police on April 21st, 2023. He pleaded not guilty to all charges. He posted bail, was fitted with an ankle monitor, and waited for the trial that would begin 11 months later. On March 4th, 2024, the trial of Dan Howard opened in a Kootenai County courtroom. Over 10 days, 62 witnesses took the stand, former law enforcement colleagues, friends of Kendi's who described her terror in the days before her death, forensic experts who dismantled the suicide narrative brick by brick, and medical professionals who explained, in terms accessible to every juror in the room, why the trajectory of a bullet does not lie. The defense, led by attorney Jason Johnson, pushed back at every point. They argued that Kendi Howard had been emotionally troubled, that the words she had spoken to her friend, "I don't even deserve to be here," had been the words of a woman on the edge of a decision she had already made. They pointed to the absence of neck injuries. They challenged the forensic pathologist's conclusions. They told the jury that the prosecution's theory was speculation dressed in the language of science, and that a reasonable doubt existed at the center of every piece of physical evidence the state had presented. But then came a moment that no legal strategy could have anticipated, a moment that transformed the atmosphere of the entire proceeding in a single, stunning instant. During the trial, Dan Howard attempted to flee the country. He left his ankle monitor behind and made his way to an airport. He was arrested there at the terminal before he could board a flight that would have taken him beyond the reach of American courts. The man who had called 911 screaming about finding his wife dead in a bathtub. The man who had maintained his innocence for 3 years, who had stood before a judge and entered a not guilty plea, who had shown up to court each morning with the composed bearing of a person confident in his eventual exoneration, had, in the moment when the verdict drew close, broken. He had tried to run. He was arrested at the airport, returned to custody, and the trial continued. On March 21, 2024, after 62 witnesses, 10 days of testimony, and just over 8 hours of deliberations, the jury returned its verdict. Guilty of second-degree murder. Guilty of domestic battery. The courtroom, packed with Kendi's family and friends, and the law enforcement officers who had spent years building the case against him, absorbed the words in silence for a moment before the emotion broke through. On May 23, 2024, Dan Howard stood before 1st District Judge Lamont Barex for sentencing. The courtroom was standing room only. Before he delivered the sentence, Judge Barex looked at Dan Howard directly and spoke with the weight of everything the trial had established. He said it had been proven beyond a reasonable doubt that Dan Howard had strangled his wife and then staged her nude body to make her death look like suicide. He said the motive had been a combination of jealousy, greed, pride, anger, and revenge, the toxic residue of a man who had watched control slip from his hands and had responded to that loss in the most devastating way imaginable. He referenced the comment Dan Howard had made years earlier about understanding why men kill their wives, and the jury heard that remark not as an old, isolated indiscretion, but as a thread woven through decades of behavior. "It's clear to me that you're a remorseless killer," the judge said, "and I don't say that lightly." He turned to the full human dimension of what had been taken. "You killed a mother. You killed a grandmother. You killed a sister. You snuffed that out because of your own pride, greed, and anger." Judge Barex sentenced Daniel C. Howard to life in prison without the possibility of parole for the murder of his wife. The 10-year sentence for domestic battery would run concurrently. Dan Howard, 58 years old, looked down at the floor as the words were delivered, his face, by every witness account, expressionless. He had nothing to say. Kendi Howard had been 48 years old when she died. She had spent her life as a small-town Idaho girl who never lost the warmth she had carried since childhood, who made strangers feel like friends, who raised a son who became a Marine, who worked in a medical center helping people, who kept animals on her land and rode horses in the open Idaho air. She left behind 2 children and a grandchild. She left behind a mother who had made a phone call 4 nights before the end, because something in her daughter's voice had told her that something was very wrong. She left behind friends who wept on the stand, and a real estate agent and a house near Camilla that she had never moved into. The physical blueprint of a life she had begun to plan, a future she had been quietly and carefully trying to build her way toward, in the only way she knew how, one careful step at a time. The house near Camilla would stand empty of her. The 10 acres in Athol would pass into other hands. The dryer, the one investigators could not stop thinking about, with its unfinished cycle running when the deputies arrived, the clothes still tumbling in the drum while the night gathered around that house, became a kind of emblem of everything that had been stolen. A woman had put her laundry on before bed. She had expected, in the most ordinary and human way possible, to be there when the cycle finished. Dan Howard, a man who had spent a career wearing the badge of the state of Idaho, who had taken an oath to protect the people around him, who had been trained in the precise anatomy of force and restraint, spent the rest of his life looking at a prison wall. Story 3. The city of St. Paul, Minnesota, had gone quiet in the way only a December night can demand. Ice crystals had formed on the edges of window panes along East 5th Street, and the few people still awake moved quickly, wrapped tight against the biting cold. Inside the lofts at Farmers Market, a modern apartment building that rose over the old warehouse district, most residents were asleep. It was almost 3 in the morning on December 16, 2022, and the world outside felt still, frozen, undisturbed. But inside apartment 260, nothing would ever be still again. At 2:50 in the morning, a 911 call crackled through to St. Paul Dispatch. A man named Matthew Ecker was on the line, his voice fractured with what sounded like grief. He said his friend, a young woman named Alexandra Pennig, had grabbed his gun, locked herself in the bathroom, and shot herself in the head. He said she was lying on the floor. He said he didn't know why she would do this. He said everything had been fine. Within minutes, police officers arrived at the building. Matthew Ecker met them at the door and led them upstairs. What they found inside that bathroom would set into motion a 2-year investigation, a stunning trial, and the unraveling of a secret that Matthew Ecker had counted on no one discovering. Alexandra Lee Penning had a warmth to her that people noticed immediately. At 32 years old, she had built a life in St. Paul that was, in many ways, a testament to how hard she had worked to reclaim herself. She was a nurse, a profession defined by care, by presence, by the willingness to show up for others even in their most broken moments. And in many ways, that described Alex herself, someone who had been broken and had fought her way back. Years before her death, Alex had struggled deeply. Depression had taken root inside her, and an addiction had followed. At one point, she had taken a handful of pills and told her mother she was trying to end her life. It had been the most frightening night of her parents' lives. But Alex had gone to rehabilitation, had worked through the darkness, and had emerged on the other side. By the time Thanksgiving 2022 arrived, her parents, Jim Penning and his wife, had sat around a table with their daughter, watched her laugh, and believed with full hearts that she was going to be all right. She was also, in December 2022, navigating something new and hopeful, a budding romantic relationship with a man named Shane Anderson. Things were moving forward. She was making plans. She was looking ahead. Matthew Ecker had entered Alex's life 2 years earlier, in 2020, when both of them worked at the same clinic. He was older, 45 years old, and carried an air of stability. He was an emergency room nurse practitioner, confident in medical settings, knowledgeable, reliable in the way someone with clinical training tends to present themselves. What Alex did not know at first, or perhaps chose not to confront fully, was that Matthew Ecker also had a wife and 4 children waiting for him in Fergus Falls, a small city about 2 hours northwest of St. Paul. Their relationship became something that existed in the spaces between his other life. Over the course of 2 years, Ecker had given Alex roughly $28,000, help with rent, help with daily expenses. He had also used his medical credentials to fill prescriptions for her, medications that showed up in an analysis of his phone records. He was deeply entangled in her life in ways that went far beyond friendship. But by December 2022, Alex was pulling away. She had Shane Anderson now. She had a different future in her sights. The day before Alex died began with a phone call. On the afternoon of December 15th, Matthew Ecker was driving to work when his phone rang. It was Alex. She told him that she and Shane Anderson had gotten into a fight and that she was frightened of what he might do. Ecker turned his car around. He took the legally owned gun from his belongings and drove to St. Paul. He arrived at Alex's apartment around 2 in the afternoon and told authorities he had come only to protect her. What followed that afternoon stretched into the evening and then into the early hours of the next morning. The two of them went out together, visiting several bars in downtown St. Paul. Somewhere around midnight, they found themselves at a place called Camp Bar. And then, in the way that a night can shift without warning, Shane Anderson walked in. Surveillance cameras inside Camp Bar captured what happened next. Anderson saw Alex and approached her. Ecker stepped in. The situation escalated quickly, and Anderson punched Ecker in the face. Bar staff intervened and removed Anderson from the premises. Ecker and Alex remained for another 45 minutes or so, drinking, regrouping, the tension of the punch hanging in the air between them. At 2:05 in the morning, they walked back to her apartment building together, their breath visible in the December cold. 19 minutes later, at 2:24 a.m., the building's lobby surveillance cameras captured something worth noting. Alex and Ecker reappeared in the lobby together. Alex returned upstairs first and waited in the building's vestibule, pacing, looking down at her phone. A few minutes passed. Then Ecker came back. At 2:30 in the morning, the two of them walked through the lobby together and rode the elevator up to Alex's apartment. That was the last moment Alexandra Penning was seen alive. 20 minutes later, the 911 call came in. When St. Paul police officers arrived at the apartment, they found Matthew Ecker in the hallway, visibly distressed. An officer named Justina Sir approached him and began asking questions. Ecker told Officer Sir that everything had been fine between him and Alex when they came home. There had been no argument. Nothing had been wrong. He said that at some point, Alex had reached into his backpack, pulled out the gun, backed herself into the bathroom, and locked the door. He said moments later he heard the gunshot. He said he immediately threw himself against the bathroom door, broke it open with his shoulder, and found Alex lying on the floor. Then, in a detail that would later draw significant attention, he added, after he had found her, after he had tried to help and realized it was too late, he had washed his hands. That, he said, was why his hands were clean. "I washed my hands," he told officers. "That's why I don't have anything on my hands." He called 911 only after washing them. Inside the small studio apartment, responding officers found alcohol and 6 bottles of prescription medication, all prescribed to Alex, including antidepressants and amphetamines. The suggestion of depression, of possible instability, hovered in the air. And then they found the gun. It was resting on Alex's chest. Her left hand was lying on top of it. The officers noted that something seemed immediately off. Alex Pennig was right-handed. Homicide detectives Abby DeSanto and Jennifer O'Donnell were called to the scene. The 2 women were experienced investigators, accustomed to the strange geometry of death scenes, to the way stories told by witnesses sometimes fit the physical evidence and sometimes do not. As they moved through the apartment, they began cataloging what Ecker had told officers and measuring it against what they could see. The gun on the left side, the right-handed woman, the clean hands, the story about breaking down the door. Detective O'Donnell began looking into Alex's background. She spoke with Alex's parents, who confirmed their daughter's history: the depression, the prior suicide attempt by overdose, the rehabilitation, and the recovery. Jim Pennig told O'Donnell that he had just seen his daughter at Thanksgiving, weeks before her death. Alex had seemed well. She had seemed present. She had not, by any of her family's accounting, seemed like a woman on the edge. Detectives also pulled security footage from the apartment building. They watched the footage from the lobby, traced the timeline of Alex and Ecker's movements through the night, and verified the sequence. The bar, the return home, the brief exit to the car, the return at 2:30, and then nothing, until the 911 call 20 minutes later. They questioned Ecker again. For hours, he maintained his account. He had not shot her. The gun had gone off behind a closed door. He had broken the door down after hearing the shot. He had tried to save her. He did not know why she would have done this. "I did not shoot her," he told them. And then, while detectives were still questioning Ecker, a call came in from the forensic unit processing the scene. Underneath Alex's body, beneath where she had lain, in the space hidden by her weight, investigators had found something small. It was a round metal piece, roughly the size of a quarter. It was part of the locking mechanism from the bathroom door. It took only a moment to understand what this meant. If Matthew Ecker's story were true, if he had broken down the door after hearing the gunshot, then this metal piece from the lock would have fallen to the floor before Alex's body. She would have been lying on the other side of the door, already shot, already fallen, by the time the door broke open. The metal piece would have landed separately. It would not have been underneath her, but it was underneath her. That tiny circle of metal told a different story entirely. It said that the door had been forced open before the gun was fired. It said that the lock broke and the piece fell, and then Alex was shot, and then she fell backward, landing on top of that piece, pressing it into the floor beneath her body. Detectives DeSanto and O'Donnell now believed they understood what had happened inside that bathroom. They believed that Alex, frightened, perhaps of Ecker, perhaps because of what had happened at the bar, perhaps because of something that had erupted between them when they returned to her apartment, had retreated to the bathroom and locked the door. That she had pressed herself against it, trying to keep him out. That Ecker had broken it open. That she had fallen backward as the door swung through the space between her legs, knocking her off balance. And that in those terrible, trapped seconds she had been shot. The gun had then been placed on her chest, her left hand arranged on top of it, in the shape of a suicide. On December 19th, 2022, 3 days after Alex died, Matthew Ecker was formally charged with second-degree murder. He denied the accusation entirely. The case that prosecutors would build over the next 14 months was meticulous and methodical, woven from threads that individually might have seemed thin, but together formed something impossible to dismiss. There was the position of the body, Alex found with her feet straddling the bathroom door, a detail consistent with someone who had been standing at the threshold when she fell. not someone who had locked herself inside and backed against the far wall. There was the metal ring from the door lock, found beneath her, its placement a silent and damning witness. There was the gun, placed on the chest of a right-handed woman, with her left hand resting on it, an arrangement that, according to the investigation, Ecker himself admitted to. He said he had moved the gun. The chief medical examiner for Ramsey County, Dr. Kelly Mills, would later testify that in all her years of practice, she had never once encountered a case in which a suicide victim's partner had repositioned the weapon. The evidence, she believed, was inconsistent with suicide. There was the matter of Alex's hands, completely clean, free of gunshot residue, which investigators noted was at odds with the mechanics of firing a weapon at close range. There was the financial entanglement, the $28,000 Ecker had given Alex, the prescriptions he had been quietly filling in her name, the relationship he had maintained while keeping a wife and 4 children in another city. And there was the motive that prosecutors offered, not because they were required to prove one, but because it answered the haunting question of why Alex Pennig had a new boyfriend. She was moving on. She was building a life that no longer had room for Matthew Ecker in it. And on the very night she died, that new boyfriend had walked into a bar and punched Ecker in front of her. The defense, represented by attorney Bruce Rivers, told jurors that both the county medical examiner and a forensic pathologist hired by the defense had classified Alex's manner of death as undetermined, not homicide. Rivers argued that Ecker had no motive to kill the woman he loved, that he had cared for her deeply, supported her through her struggles, and that the circumstantial evidence was not sufficient to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that he had pulled the trigger. The prosecution reminded jurors, calmly and repeatedly, that motive was not a legal requirement for conviction. Matthew Ecker's trial began on February 8, 2024 in Ramsey County. 8 days of testimony, forensic evidence, body camera footage, surveillance video, and the quiet, devastating precision of 2 homicide detectives who had refused to accept the story they had been handed on the night Alex died. The jury deliberated for 7 hours. On February 16, 2024, they returned a verdict, guilty of second-degree intentional murder. On April 3, 2024, Judge D.N. Hilgers sentenced Matthew Ecker to 30 years in prison, a sentence nearly 5 years longer than the standard guidelines would have suggested. The judge's decision reflected the weight of what had been done, not merely the killing of a young woman, but the calculated attempt to dress that killing as something Alex had done to herself, to use her own history, her own pain, her own past struggles as a costume for his crime. In January 2025, Ecker appealed his conviction, arguing that the circumstantial evidence had been insufficient. A 3-judge panel of the Minnesota Court of Appeals reviewed the case in April 2025 and rejected the appeal unanimously. The appellate judges wrote that the positioning of Alex's legs at the bathroom door and the metal latch found beneath her body supported the prosecution's theory, and that a reasonable jury could have inferred guilt from the totality of the evidence. What lingers in the story of Alexandra Pennig is not only the violence of what happened in that bathroom in the early morning hours of December 16, 2022, it is the cruelty of the story that was told in its aftermath. A story designed to turn Alex's real suffering, her history of depression, her struggles with addiction, her hard-won recovery, into an alibi. A story that took the most painful chapters of her life and tried to use them against her even after she was gone. Her father, Jim Pennig, had told police detectives that he had just seen his daughter at Thanksgiving, that she had seemed well, that she had been present, alive, someone moving forward. The investigators who heard that, Detectives DeSanto and O'Donnell, had carried that knowledge with them through every interview, every piece of evidence, every long hour of a case that had been designed to make the truth look like something else. A quarter-sized piece of metal proved them right. Justice, in the case of Alexandra Pennig, did not arrive loudly. It arrived the way truth often does in a courtroom, patiently, carefully, piece by piece, until the picture assembled itself so clearly that 12 ordinary people needed only 7 hours to see it. Alexandra Lee Pennig was 32 years old. She was a nurse. She was someone's daughter. She was a woman who had fought her way through darkness and had, by all accounts, found her footing again. She did not take her own life in a bathroom in St. Paul on a cold December morning. She was murdered, and the man who murdered her, who then arranged the scene, washed his hands, and called 911, is now serving 30 years in a Minnesota prison, held accountable not by chance or luck, but by the work of investigators who looked at a small metal ring and refused to look away. Story 4. The rain had been falling all day over Granby, Massachusetts, a quiet, unassuming town in the western part of the state where neighbors waved to each other across well-kept lawns and life moved with a gentle, unhurried rhythm. It was the kind of place where people rarely locked their doors, where children played freely on side streets, and where the worst things that happened were small-town disagreements quickly forgotten over a cup of coffee. But on March 29, 2010, that quiet was shattered in a way that Granby would never fully recover from. It began, as so many tragedies do, not with a sudden explosion of violence visible to the world, but behind closed doors, inside a home at 18 Barton Street, where two women had built a life together that was equal parts love and turmoil. Anna Marie Cochran Rintala was a force of nature. At 37, she was big-hearted, loud in the best possible way, and the kind of person who made every room feel more alive simply by entering it. She had grown up in Springfield, Massachusetts, knowing from a young age that she was different from the girls around her, and she had made peace with that difference long before most people in her world were ready to. Her motto was live, laugh, love, and she didn't just say it, she lived it, throwing herself into every celebration, every friendship, every moment with abandon. She became a paramedic because the job suited her perfectly, fast-paced, unpredictable, and demanding a kind of steady courage under pressure that she had in abundance. She thrived on being needed. She thrived on the rush of helping people in the worst moments of their lives. And it was on the job, sometime around 2002, that she met Cara Rintala. Cara was 7 years older, and in almost every visible way, she was Anna Marie's opposite. Where Anna Marie was warm and spontaneous, Cara was composed and deliberate. Where Anna Marie wore her emotions openly, Cara kept hers close to her chest. She was slender and aloof, measured in her words, careful in her movements. But opposites attract, and for a time, what Cara and Anna Marie had together was something that looked unmistakably like love. By 2005, Anna Marie had moved into Cara's home in Granby. 2 years later, they traveled to Provincetown, one of the earliest places in America to recognize same-sex unions, and were married in an era when such a ceremony was still a powerful, rare statement about who a person was and what they believed love could be. Shortly after, they adopted a baby girl named Brianna, who was less than a week old when she came into their arms. For a moment, at least, it seemed like the life they'd built together was complete. But even from the beginning, there were cracks. The trouble in the Rintala household was not hidden from the world for long. Anna Marie was a passionate spender, the kind of person who lived for the moment without much thought for tomorrow's bills. Tens of thousands of dollars in credit card debt accumulated over the years, and Cara, who was meticulous about finances, seethed quietly. What began as financial tension deepened into something more corrosive. In September 2008, Anna Marie walked into the Granby police station and asked for a restraining order. She told officers that Cara had physically abused her. When Cara came in to give her side of the story, she was arrested and charged with domestic assault and battery. The charge was later dropped at Anna Marie's request, but the incident had already left a mark, not just legally, but emotionally, on both women and on the community that knew them. The following year, 2009, brought more upheaval. The couple separated, and during that separation, Anna Marie rekindled a romance with an old girlfriend, Carla Daniele, a Springfield police officer. The relationship was passionate but brief, and before the year was out, Anna Marie had racked up another $10,000 in debt on Danielle's accounts. Then, without warning, she told Daniele it was over. She was returning to Cara. From Carla's perspective, perhaps the love of her life was coming back to her. She was blindsided. Carla said she was devastated. She took it very hard. At the same time, Anna Marie had developed an unusually close friendship with a married man from work named Marco Lexic. The connection between them was emotional and intimate in ways that blurred the line between friendship and something more. She had even convinced him to co-sign 3 credit cards with her. Anna Marie's personal life was a web of connections, some loving, some complicated, all deeply felt. She was not a simple woman. Neither was the marriage she had returned to. On the night of March 28th, 2010, just hours before everything fell apart, Anna-Marie sent a furious text to Kara. She had discovered that Kara had invited a man over to their home while Anna-Marie was working her overnight shift. "I hate the relationship we have," Anna-Marie wrote. "No one does that, no respect." Those words, typed in anger and frustration, would be the last text messages the two women ever exchanged. The morning of March 29th, 2010 began with something approaching normalcy. Anna-Marie arrived home from her overnight shift at around 8:30 in the morning. The couple had coffee. They played with 2-year-old Brianna. They had lunch together. In the early afternoon, Anna-Marie said she wanted to nap before her next overnight shift and asked Kara to take Brianna out for a few hours. Kara agreed. Around 3 p.m., she buckled Brianna into the car and drove away from 18 Barton Street. What happened in that house during the hours that followed remains one of the most disputed questions in the entire case. What is known about the next few hours is what Kara herself described and what surveillance cameras and receipts recorded. She drove to a neighboring town to show Brianna some llamas. The little girl laughed and called them long-haired cows. Then they headed to the Holyoke Mall, arriving just before 5 p.m. At Target, surveillance cameras captured Kara's Ford Explorer pulling into the parking lot. Noticeably, there was a laundry basket and a red bag in the open bed of the truck, sitting in the rain. Inside the mall, Kara and Brianna went to the Children's Place and the Gap, buying small items, t-shirts, socks. All the while, Kara texted Anna-Marie repeatedly. There was no reply. She started calling instead. Still nothing. What happened next was strange, and would later draw intense scrutiny. Before heading home, Kara stopped at a McDonald's, not to buy food, but to drive around to the farthest corner of the parking lot and throw some rags into a trash bin. Then she went to a Stop and Shop and spent a small amount on groceries. Then to a Burger King in Chicopee, where she bought Brianna a children's meal. All of this time, she was calling Anna-Marie, and Anna-Marie was not answering. When they finally pulled up to 18 Barton Street, something else caught investigators' attention later. The laundry basket and red bag that had been in the truck bed had disappeared. Kara left Brianna in the car. She went inside, and then, according to her own account, she found her wife. Anna-Marie was at the bottom of the basement stairs, lying still on the cold concrete floor. Kara says she did not know what to do. She did not want to frighten Brianna. She ran back out of the house, crossed to the neighbor's home, and knocked on the door of Roy Dupuis, a 65-year-old flooring installer who had been watching Wheel of Fortune with his wife. "Call 911, Kara told him, handing Brianna over. "Anne's in the basement." Then she turned and ran back home through the rain. When police and paramedics arrived at 18 Barton Street that evening, they found Kara in the basement, cradling Anna-Marie's body in her arms, screaming, "She's dead. I can't believe she's dead." What the officers saw in that basement told a story that was deeply disturbing. Anna-Marie Cochran Rintola was dead. She had been strangled, the life choked out of her. She had lacerations on her head, and covering her body and spread across the crime scene was a strange, pale-colored paint, splattered over the floor, over Anna-Marie's clothes, over the surfaces around her. Paint all over the place, all over this female, Sergeant Gary Poehler of the Granby Police Department would later describe. It was an unsettling detail, one that didn't make immediate sense. Why would a woman found at the bottom of a staircase, the apparent victim of a terrible fall or accident, be covered in paint? The medical examiner's findings made the situation even more grave. Anna-Marie had not simply fallen. She had been strangled. This was a homicide, and the clues left behind pointed investigators in a direction they had perhaps already been considering from the very first moment they arrived. Massachusetts State Trooper Jamie McGarrion was the lead investigator assigned to the case, and from early on, he saw details that troubled him. When he arrived at the scene, sometime after 7:20 that evening, rigor mortis, the stiffening of the muscles that begins several hours after death, was already well advanced in Anna-Marie's body. Yet the paint splattered across the basement floor, and over her body was still wet. That combination was deeply significant. If Anna-Marie had been dead long enough for rigor mortis to set in, why was the paint only recently applied? The only explanation that made sense to investigators was that someone had been in that basement after Anna-Marie died, someone who had deliberately disturbed the scene. And Trooper Megarian drew a pointed conclusion. Whoever's in that house disturbing that scene, creating that break-in, is very comfortable that nobody else is coming home. No one else has that comfort. A former chief medical examiner's assessment added weight to this theory. Their analysis suggested that Anna-Marie had died sometime between mid to late morning and early afternoon. Not in the evening, as might have been assumed, but during the very hours when, according to Kara's own account, the two women had been home together before Kara took Brianna out. Investigators also scrutinized Kara's alibi with growing concern. Kara claimed she had left the house around 3 p.m., yet she wasn't captured on any surveillance footage until just before 5 p.m. at the Holyoke Mall. That left roughly 2 hours unaccounted for. The strange errand at McDonald's, driving to the back of the parking lot only to throw rags in a bin, without buying any food, struck investigators as highly unusual. So did the laundry basket and bag that had been in the truck and then vanished by the time Kara arrived home. Authorities also considered others in Anna-Marie's life. Marco Lexic had receipts confirming he had been elsewhere that day, and investigators found no motive for him to have harmed Anna-Marie. Carla Daniele, the ex-girlfriend who had been left heartbroken when Anna-Marie returned to Kara, was at her gym with surveillance footage to prove it. The circle was narrowing. 16 months after Anna-Marie's death, in October 2011, Kara Rintala was arrested and charged with murder. What followed was one of the most extraordinary legal sagas in the history of Massachusetts. Kara's first trial took place in early 2013. For weeks, the jury heard the evidence, the wet paint and the rigor mortis, the timeline gaps, the angry texts, the history of domestic violence, the strange errands. Kara maintained her innocence throughout, and when the jury went to deliberate, they could not reach a verdict. The trial ended in a hung jury. The state tried again in 2014. A second jury was assembled. The evidence was presented once more. And once more, the jury deadlocked. Another hung jury, another mistrial. The case had become something of a legal phenomenon, not just in Massachusetts, but in legal circles across the country. The evidence was entirely circumstantial. There was no DNA. There were no fingerprints that conclusively pointed to Kara. There was no witness who had seen what happened inside that basement. As one observer noted, there was no video. There was no silver bullet of DNA or fingerprints that conclusively determined that Kara Rintala had done this. So that made it a difficult case. For the third trial, in 2016, prosecutors sharpened their approach. They brought in an expert who testified about the drying time of paint, arguing that the scene had been deliberately staged after Anna-Marie's death. They leaned heavily on the angry text messages from the night before and argued that the seemingly pointless errands, the llamas, the mall, the McDonald's parking lot, the Burger King, were not spontaneous acts of a grieving woman, but the calculated movements of someone constructing an alibi. Prosecutors also proposed a specific theory of the crime. They suggested that on the morning of March 29th, Kara and Anna-Marie had a violent argument, perhaps triggered by the same rage that had been simmering in those late-night texts about disrespect and betrayal. During that fight, Anna-Marie fell down the stairs. But then, and this is where prosecutors painted a portrait of cold calculation, Kara made a decision. Months earlier, a judge handling the couple's ongoing conflicts had warned that if the arguing continued, he would contact Child Protective Services. Kara, who loved Brianna fiercely, faced an impossible choice. Call for help and risk losing her daughter, her home, her livelihood, or make sure Anna-Marie could never testify against her. The defendant had to make a choice, Prosecutor Gagné told the jury. Call for help, likely face criminal charges, lose her home, lose her daughter, lose her livelihood, or on the other hand, make him go away. And she made her choice. This time, the jury agreed. Kara Rintala was convicted of murder in the first degree and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. For Anna-Marie's family, it was a moment of relief almost too long in coming. I trusted her with my niece's life and she took it, said Uncle Pat, the same man who had once banged on a motel room door to protect a teenage Anna-Marie decades before. But the story was not over. Kara appealed her conviction, and in a ruling that sent shockwaves through the case, a higher Massachusetts court determined that the expert who had testified about the paint drying time was not sufficiently reliable to have been admitted as evidence. The conviction was overturned. Kara Rintala, who had maintained her innocence every single day since her arrest, now faced the prospect of a fourth trial. She was nearly a decade and a half older than the woman who had once handed her daughter to a neighbor and run back through the rain. The case had consumed her life, just as it had consumed the lives of Anna Marie's family, who were forced to relive the worst day of their lives again and again in courtroom after courtroom. In September 2023, the fourth trial began in Northampton Superior Court. This time, prosecutors stripped their case down to its essentials. They focused on the timeline, the 2-hour gap, the peculiar errands, the missing bag, and did not call any expert to testify about the paint, having learned a hard lesson from the appellate court's ruling. Kara's defense team fought back, calling their own medical expert who testified that based on the available evidence, it was entirely possible that Anna Marie had not died until after 3 p.m., meaning that Kara might have already left the house by the time the fatal moment occurred. The jury deliberated. The verdict, when it came in October 2023, was neither the full acquittal Kara's supporters had hoped for nor the first-degree murder conviction prosecutors had pursued. The jury found Kara Rintala guilty of voluntary manslaughter, a verdict that acknowledged Anna Marie had been killed unlawfully, but stopped short of finding the premeditation required for murder in the first degree. She was sentenced to 12 to 14 years in prison, with credit for the time she had already served. The Kara Rintala case endures as one of the most legally complex and emotionally devastating criminal cases in Massachusetts history. Over the span of 13 years for trials, 2 hung juries, a first-degree murder conviction, an overturned verdict, and a final finding of voluntary manslaughter, the justice system wrestled repeatedly with a case built entirely on circumstantial evidence and reached 4 different conclusions. What the courtrooms could not fully resolve, the human heart feels with quiet certainty. Anna Marie Cochran Rintala, the paramedic who spent her life rushing toward people in crisis, the woman whose motto was live, laugh, love, the mother who had laughed and danced and filled rooms with her infectious energy was gone. She was 37 years old. Her daughter Brianna grew up without her. Her smile, and the life it belonged to, was taken on a rainy Monday in a small Massachusetts town. What exactly happened in that basement, in those quiet hours between morning and afternoon, may never be known with absolute certainty. The courts did their best with what they had. But in the end, the most honest answer to the question of what happened to Anna Marie Rintala lives in the silence between the facts. In the wet paint, the missing bag, the unanswered texts, and the 2-hour gap that no one has ever fully explained. Justice, in this case, arrived slowly, imperfectly, and at enormous cost to everyone involved. But for Anna Marie's family, one truth has always been clear. She deserved better. She deserved to grow old. She deserved to see her daughter grow up. And she deserved, above all, to be remembered not as a victim at the bottom of a staircase, but as the extraordinary woman she was, full of life, full of laughter, and deeply, fiercely loved. Story 5. The cold of a Quebec winter has a way of seeping into everything. It frosts the glass, bites at exposed skin, and sometimes it seems to find its way into the hidden fissures of the human heart, freezing what was once warm and turning it brittle. For Dr. Guy Turcotte and Dr. Isabel Gaston, the winter of 2009 would bring a cold so profound it would shatter their world, leaving behind a silence that could never be filled. To the outside world, they were a portrait of success. 2 doctors, intelligent and driven, building a life together in the quiet, affluent suburbs north of Montreal. They had met in Quebec City in 1999, 2 bright minds drawn to one another, and moved in together a year later. Guy was a cardiologist, a specialist who dealt with the intricate mechanics of the human heart, and Isabel, an emergency room physician and coroner, a woman who confronted life's most abrupt and tragic endings on a daily basis. Their professions placed them at the nexus of life and death, a place of high stakes and immense pressure. They built a family. A son, Olivier, was born, a bright, energetic boy who would grow to be 5. Then came a daughter, Anne-Sophie, a sweet, 3-year-old girl who completed their home. Guy's brother would later recall how attentive Guy was, not just to his own children, but to his nieces and nephews. When Guy played with the kids, you could see the pure, uncomplicated joy on his face. He seemed to have as much fun as they did. He was, by many accounts, a doting father, a man who seemed to find a softer, more genuine version of himself in the presence of his children. But beneath the surface of this idyllic family picture, the foundation was unstable. The relationship between Guy and Isabel was fraught with a tension that sometimes erupted into open hostility. There were arguments, moments of domestic strife so sharp that they led to Guy moving out, only for them to reconcile shortly after, buoyed by the promise to work on their relationship. It was during one of these periods of renewed hope that Guy proposed to Isabel on a trip to Mount Washington. She accepted, and they moved forward, layering new commitments over old cracks. They were both professionals, accustomed to dealing with stress, but the stress of their own home was a different, more insidious kind. Isabel would later speak of a marriage where she felt she could never be perfect in her husband's eyes, a constant, low-grade pressure to meet an unstated ideal. Guy, in turn, was a man who struggled to express his emotions, a man with narcissistic traits who tended to intellectualize his feelings, keeping them contained until they could no longer be held back. The love was there, but it was tangled with resentment and a failure to truly connect. The final fracture came not from an explosive argument, but from a quiet betrayal. In mid-January of 2009, the family was planning a trip to Mexico, a sunny escape from the Canadian winter. Just before they were set to leave, Guy Turcotte learned that his wife was having an affair. The other man was not a stranger. He was Martin Hewitt, their personal trainer, and a man Guy considered a friend. The news was delivered by Hewitt's own girlfriend, who provided the irrefutable proof, a string of emails between Isabel and her lover. The betrayal was absolute. Turcotte felt it as a physical blow. He was angry, wounded, but he did not cancel the trip. The four of them, Guy, Isabel, Olivier, and Aunt Sophie, went to Mexico, a family already broken, performing a pantomime of togetherness under the tropical sun. The decision was made there, amidst the palm trees and the sound of the ocean. They would separate. 2 days after they returned to the snow-covered landscape of Quebec, Guy Turcotte packed his belongings and left the family home. Isabel and the children remained. They agreed to share custody, a modern, civilized arrangement that belied the turmoil churning beneath. But civility was a thin veneer. The separation opened the floodgates to a torrent of spiteful conversations and escalating bitterness. The man who had once been the center of his family was now on the outside, looking in, and the view was maddening. On February 8th, just a few weeks into the new arrangement, Guy received a piece of information that felt, in his own words, like a hammer to the head. Isabel had taken the children to the Carnival de Quebec, a winter festival that held a special meaning for him, as he had lived in Quebec City for many years. And they had not gone alone. Martin Hewitt had been with them. The image of this other man, this man who had stolen his wife, now stepping into his place with his children, was unbearable. I could not accept that Martin spent time with my children, as if I was being replaced, he later testified. The next day, the wound was torn open further. A former neighbor casually informed him that on the very day he had moved out, Martin Hewitt had spent the night at the house. He had been staying there almost every night for the past 2 weeks. The information, Turcotte said, made him flip. The sense of replacement was no longer a fear. It was a reality. His home, his bed, his family, they were being occupied by another. On February 10th, this simmering rage boiled over. He drove to the house, his house, on the pretext of fetching his son's sweater. In the kitchen, the heart of the home, he found him. Martin Hewitt. The two men stood facing each other in the space that had once been Guy's. "You stole my wife. You betrayed me, you were my friend," Turcotte said, the words a raw expression of his pain and fury. He then punched Hewitt in the face before turning and leaving, the single act of violence a punctuation mark on his spiraling descent. The following days were a slow burn of agony. The man who was used to being in control was losing his grip on everything that mattered. He was a cardiologist who could no longer regulate the frantic, painful rhythm of his own life. On Friday, February 20th, 2009, the final day began like any other in his fractured new reality. He went to work at the hospital, and his colleagues noted no outward signs of distress. He was a doctor, trained to maintain a professional facade, to compartmentalize. He exchanged emails with Isabel. He picked up Olivier from school and Aunt Sophie from daycare, their small hands in his, their chatter a temporary balm. But later he drove by his old house, a moth drawn to a flame that would burn him. Isabel saw him and ordered him to leave. Her words, delivered over the phone, were sharp and final, each one a nail in the coffin of his old life. "You're going to stop controlling my life," she told him. "Now, if I want to, I can change the children's names. I can get custody. I can move anywhere in Quebec." She had consulted a lawyer. She had changed the locks on the house. For Turcotte, this was not just an assertion of her independence. It was a declaration of war. The threat of losing his children, of having their very names changed, was a terror beyond comprehension. He felt it as a profound attack. His response was cold and clipped. If she wanted a war, she was going to get it. That night, alone in the rented house in Piedmont that was now his home, the facade crumbled completely. The children were asleep in their beds, blissfully unaware of the storm raging within their father. He felt dejected, a hollowed-out man. The tears he had held back for so long began to fall. He sat in the sterile quiet of his temporary life and opened his laptop. He began to read old emails from Isabel, messages from a time when things were different, and then from times when they were falling apart. Each word was a fresh injury, further disheartening him, reinforcing his sense of loss and failure. He wanted to die. The pain was too great, the future a black void. He turned to the cold, impersonal logic of the internet, searching for methods to commit suicide. The thought of ending his own life became a singular, desperate focus. He found what he was looking for: windshield washer fluid. The blue liquid, filled with poisonous methanol, promised a final escape. He went to the garage and brought the container inside. But as he contemplated his own death, another thought, twisted and terrible, began to form in his mind. A thought born of a distorted, sick love. If he was gone, who would find him? His children, Olivier and Aunt Sophie. They would wake up in the morning and find their father's body. The image was a horror he could not bear. He decided, in that moment of profound mental breakdown, that he had to spare them that pain. He had to take them with him. He recalled standing in Olivier's room. The knife was in his hands. He stabbed his son. The small boy cried out, a single word of protest and disbelief. "No." He tried to move away. In that moment, Turcotte testified, he realized he was hurting him. The realization brought not a halt, but a surge of panic. He stabbed him again, and again, and again, a frantic, desperate violence born of a mind that had shattered. 27 times. He had a similar, nightmarish memory of his daughter's room. The same frenzied attack. 19 times. He saw himself in the bathroom afterward. He drank the blue windshield washer fluid, the act of suicide now an epilogue to a crime he could barely comprehend. His hands were covered in blood. He had hurt his children. He looked for the knife to stab himself in the heart, to finish what he had started, but he couldn't find it. He collapsed, the poison and the horror overwhelming him. He crawled under his bed, a wounded animal seeking a dark, hidden place to die. The next morning, Saturday, February 21st, Guy Turcotte's mother grew worried. She had spoken to her son the night before, and he had expressed suicidal thoughts. She called 911. 2 police officers were dispatched to the rented house in Piedmont for a wellness check. They entered the home and were met with an unnatural silence. Then they found them, the inert bodies of 2 small children, a boy and a girl, in their beds. The scene was one of unimaginable violence. In the master bedroom, they found Guy Turcotte. He was under the bed, covered in blood and vomit, barely conscious. He told the officers what he had done. He told them he had drunk the windshield wiper fluid. He told them he wanted to die. But he had not died. He had only succeeded in destroying everything he had ever loved. The news reached Isabel Gaston like a physical blow, a force so powerful it knocked the air from her lungs and the ground from under her feet. She was at the hospital, in the middle of a shift, when she was told. The woman who dealt with tragedy every day was now at the center of the most profound tragedy of all. Her ex-husband, the father of her children, had murdered them. The grief was an ocean, vast and drowning. But as the initial shock subsided, it was joined by something else, a steely resolve for justice. The legal battle that followed would captivate and outrage the province of Quebec. Guy Turcotte was charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder. His trial began on April 12, 2011. The core of his defense was not that he hadn't killed his children. He admitted to that from the start, but that he was not criminally responsible for his actions due to a mental disorder. His lawyers argued that at the time of the killings, Turcotte was suffering from an adjustment disorder with anxiety and depressive moods, a mental state so severe that he was unable to form the intent to kill. He was a man pushed beyond his breaking point by the collapse of his marriage, the loss of his family, and the fear of being replaced. A defense psychiatrist, Dr. Dominique Bourget, testified that Turcotte was suffering from a major mental illness that made him incapable of telling right from wrong. Another expert, Dr. Louis Morissette, argued that Turcotte killed his children to prevent them from the trauma of finding his body, a decision that was the product of a sick mind, not a malicious one. The defense painted a portrait of a man so consumed by suicidal despair that he had lost all contact with reality. The Crown prosecutor, René Verret, presented a starkly different narrative. This was not a story of mental collapse, but of calculated revenge. Verret argued that Turcotte was a man in control, a narcissist who deliberately killed his children to punish Isabelle Gaston for leaving him. The prosecution's experts countered the defense, stating that while Turcotte was certainly suffering from an adjustment disorder, this type of disorder does not cause a person to lose the ability to reflect or understand the consequences of their actions. The timing of the methanol ingestion became a crucial point of contention. Turcotte and his defense team insisted he drank the windshield washer fluid before the killings, in a genuine suicide attempt, and that the decision to kill the children came after. The Crown argued the opposite. Verret pointed to the evidence. Blood was found on the washer fluid containers, suggesting he had handled them after the stabbings. A medical assessment on the night of his arrest concluded that he had ingested the poison no more than 90 minutes before arriving at the hospital, after the children were already dead. This, the Crown contended, was not a suicide attempt that led to murder, but a murder followed by a half-hearted attempt to feign suicide. On July 5, 2011, after a long and harrowing trial, the jury delivered its verdict. They found Guy Turcotte not criminally responsible by reason of a mental disorder. A wave of shock and outrage swept through Quebec. To many, it seemed that a man who had admitted to stabbing his 2 children a total of 46 times was, in essence, getting away with murder. Isabelle Gaston was devastated. The justice system had failed her children. Turcotte was sent to the Philippe Pinel Institute, a psychiatric hospital in Montreal. In 2012, after just over a year of treatment, he appeared before a mental health review board and declared himself ready for release. He said he felt less shame, less guilt, had more self-esteem, and was no longer a danger to anyone. The board agreed, and he was released, a decision that poured salt on the open wound of public opinion. But the legal story was not over. The prosecution appealed the verdict, arguing that the trial judge had made a critical error in his instructions to the jury, particularly regarding the issue of self-induced intoxication from the methanol. In November 2013, the Quebec Court of Appeal overturned the verdict and ordered a new trial. The law itself was changing in the wake of the case, with new federal legislation making it more difficult to obtain an NCR verdict. Turcotte, who had been free, was rearrested and taken back into custody to await his second trial, though he was later released on bail in September 2014. The second trial began in September 2015. The arguments were largely the same, a retreading of the same horrific ground. The dueling psychiatrists once again took the stand, presenting their conflicting views of Turcotte's mental state. The jury heard again about the crumbling marriage, the affair, the changed locks, and the final terrible night. They heard Turcotte's own tearful testimony, his fragmented memories of the horror he had unleashed. This time, Isabelle Gaston was a more vocal presence, a powerful advocate for her slain children. "Today, I hope the souls of Olivier and Aunt Sophie can be at peace," she told reporters, her voice thick with an emotion that had not faded in the 6 years since their deaths. On December 6, 2015, after 7 days of deliberation, the second jury reached a different conclusion. They rejected the defense of not criminally responsible. They also rejected the charge of first-degree murder, which would have implied premeditation. They found Guy Turcotte guilty of 2 counts of second-degree murder. The verdict brought a muffled yes from the direction of Isabel Gaston in the courtroom. It was not the complete victory she might have hoped for, but it was an acknowledgement. It was a statement that he was responsible. On January 15, 2016, Guy Turcotte was sentenced to life in prison, with no possibility of parole for 17 years. His lawyer would later appeal the parole eligibility, but it was upheld. The legal saga was finally over. The case of Guy Turcotte left deep scars on the collective psyche of Quebec. It forced a difficult conversation about mental illness, domestic conflict, and the nature of justice. It questioned the ability of the legal system to account for acts of such profound and personal violence. But for Isabel Gaston, the woman at the heart of the storm, the end of the trials was not an end to the pain. It was simply the beginning of a different kind of life, one lived in the shadow of an unimaginable loss. A life dedicated to healing, to remembering, and to honoring the 2 small souls who were stolen from her in the deepest cold of a winter night. Story 6. In the shimmering heat of a Dallas summer, where high society was a religion and charm a currency more valuable than oil, Sandra Bridewell moved like a phantom of grace and elegance. She was a woman crafted from the fantasies of a southern novel, beautiful, with magnificent dark eyes that could hold a man's gaze and make him feel, in a single moment, utterly enchanted. Her voice was a soft, feminine melody, her manners immaculate. To the world, she was a loving mother, a devoted wife, a pillar of her community who devoted herself to charities and took a keen interest in the arts. But beneath the carefully constructed veneer of this southern belle, a chilling darkness coiled. It was a darkness that trailed her like a shadow, leaving in its wake a string of broken lives, shattered fortunes, and a trail of bodies that stretched across 3 decades. This is the story of Sandra Bridewell, the woman they called the Black Widow, a fatal beauty whose allure was as captivating as it was deadly. Her story begins not in the opulent drawing rooms of Highland Park, but in the quiet, middle-class landscape of the mid-20th century. Born in 1944 in Sedalia, Missouri, she was given up as an infant by her natural parents and adopted by Arthur and Camille Powers. Her early life was marked by a foundational tragedy. When she was just 3 years old, her adoptive mother was killed in a car accident. Her father, the manager of a Dr. Pepper bottling plant, eventually remarried and moved the family to Oak Cliff, Texas, a suburb of Dallas, where he took a job selling cemetery plots. The move did not bring stability. Sandra's relationship with her stepmother, Doris, was a landscape of conflict. To friends, she would later recount stories of a childhood steeped in emotional neglect, of being locked in closets, of a birthday party where no one came because, she claimed, her stepmother forgot to mail the invitations. Doris, she said, would tell her she was unwanted, that she had no friends. Whether these stories were true or the first blossoms of a lifelong talent for self-serving fiction, they formed the core of the narrative she presented to the world, that of a beautiful, wounded creature deserving of sympathy and protection. She was, as one friend would later put it, a Cinderella figure, always waiting for a prince to rescue her from the ashes of her unhappy youth. She graduated from Kimball High School in 1962, a pretty but largely unnoticed girl who did not appear in her senior class yearbook. But as she moved into her early 20s, she began to cultivate the persona that would define her life. She instinctively knew what men wanted. While her peers were reading movie magazines, Sandra was absorbing Southern living, learning the arts of the sophisticated hostess, mastering the recipe for flaming plum pudding. She had, a friend recalled, a ladylike, poor helpless me routine that men found irresistible. Her ambition was a quiet but ferocious fire. She was determined to marry into money. The life of a Dallas socialite, with its country club lunches, charity balls, and European travels, was the world she craved, and she pursued it with a single-minded focus. She developed a habit of lying about her past, creating a more glamorous backstory for herself. To some, her parents were Irish aristocrats. To others, she claimed to have attended universities where she had never enrolled. She told one early friend that a beautiful, landscaped home in a wealthy part of Oak Cliff was where she grew up, a lie that was exposed when the friend had to visit her actual, much more modest family home. But the lies were often told with such conviction, such disarming sweetness, that people, especially men, chose to believe. In 1967, her prince arrived in the form of Dr. David Stiegel, a handsome, ambitious young dentist. Like Sandra, David had aspirations. He didn't want to be an ordinary suburban dentist. He wanted to be the society dentist of Dallas, specializing in full-mouth reconstructions for the city's elite. He had studied in Los Angeles, learning the ways of Hollywood dentists, and he had a taste for Cadillacs, big houses, and pretty women. Sandra, with her beauty and burgeoning sophistication, was the perfect complement to his ambitions. After a whirlwind 6-week courtship, they were married. They settled into the upscale world of Dallas society with an almost desperate eagerness. Sandra was a natural. She was a brilliant hostess, throwing lavish dinner parties where no detail was overlooked. She joined the Wright Church, St. Michael and All Angels Episcopal, and became the cookbook chairman. She was creative, perceptive, and utterly charming. David, a quiet man by nature, was led through the social world by his wife, and it paid dividends for his practice. His income tripled. They moved into a fine home in the Greenway Parks neighborhood and immediately began expensive renovations. They hired a live-in maid, had their groceries delivered from the chicest store in town, and dressed in the finest clothes. But their grasp exceeded their reach. They were living the life of Dallas's old money crowd, but they didn't have old money. They were drowning in debt. Sandra's taste for fine art and expensive antiques was insatiable. She paid a renowned interior designer $35,000, an astronomical sum at the time, to decorate their home. David was forced to borrow a substantial amount of money from his father to pay down their bills. The pressure was immense. By 1974, their marriage was in turmoil. In February 1975, the strain became too much for David Stiegel. Sandra claimed she found him in a closet, holding a gun to his head, and talked him out of it. But it was only a temporary reprieve. A few weeks later, on a cold winter morning, David was found dead in their bed. He had slashed both of his wrists, and he had a .22 caliber gunshot wound to the head. The Dallas County Medical Examiner ruled his death a suicide. Sandra was now a widow. If she was devastated, she hid it well. She quickly collected the life insurance money, sold David's dental practice, and began dating again. She was still beautiful, still charming, and now she was a tragic figure, a young widow with 3 small daughters to raise. Wealthy, powerful men were drawn to her story. A little more than 3 years after David's death, she was married again, this time to Bobby Bridewell, a well-known and much-loved Dallas developer who had conceived the luxurious mansion on Turtle Creek Hotel. With her marriage to Bobby Bridewell, Sandra's ascent into the highest echelons of Dallas society was complete. Bobby adopted her 3 girls, and they made their home in Highland Park, the wealthiest and most exclusive neighborhood in Dallas. For a time, it seemed she had finally achieved her life's ambition. But tragedy, or something that looked like it, was never far behind her. In 1980, just 2 years into their marriage, Bobby was diagnosed with terminal lymph cancer. As her husband fought for his life, Sandra's behavior grew increasingly strange. She threw herself into a massive remodeling of their home, forcing the ailing Bobby to move in with a friend. He would never return to the house he had shared with her. He died 2 years after his diagnosis, in 1982. Sandra was a widow for the second time. During Bobby's long illness, Sandra had become intensely close to his oncologist, Dr. John Bagwell, and his wife, Betsy. Betsy Bagwell was a kind, sympathetic woman, known for befriending her husband's patients and their families. After Bobby's death, Sandra began to call Betsy my new best friend. She seemed to depend on the Bagwells for everything, but the friendship soon became suffocating. Sandra was a constant, demanding presence in their lives. She showed up unannounced at their vacation home in New Mexico. There were incessant phone calls, frequent requests for childcare. The Bagwells, growing weary of her smothering attention, tried to create some distance. Dr. Bagwell, after a suspicious incident where Sandra claimed her car had stalled and lured him from his home only for the car to start immediately for a police officer, angrily told her to get out of their lives. He told his wife to stay away from her. But Sandra would not be deterred. On a Wednesday in July of 1982, just 2 months after Bobby Bridewell's death, Sandra called Betsy. She was upset, she said, about a letter she had supposedly found, a letter that suggested Bobby had been having an affair. Betsy, though wary, was drawn back in by the drama. Later that day, Sandra called again. Her car had stalled at a church, and she needed a ride to Love Field Airport to pick up a rental car. Betsy, a woman who found it hard to say no, agreed to help. The exact sequence of events that followed remains a mystery, shrouded in Sandra's conflicting accounts. According to police, Betsy drove Sandra to the airport, but Sandra had forgotten her driver's license and couldn't get a car. Sandra claimed Betsy, then drove her back to her car at the church, which once again started without a problem. Sandra said she then went shopping. At 8:20 that evening, police found Betsy Bagwell slumped in the driver's seat of her powder blue Mercedes station wagon in the terminal parking lot at Love Field. She had a single bullet hole in her right temple. A .22 caliber revolver was in her hand. The Dallas County Medical Examiner, despite a number of troubling questions, ruled the death a suicide. But to those who knew Betsy, the verdict was unbelievable. She was a devoted mother who lived for her family. That afternoon, she had put meat in the sink to thaw for dinner, telling her children not to pig out before she got back. Why would she kill herself? And where did she get the gun? It was a stolen Saturday night special, a cheap pistol registered to a deceased man from Oak Cliff. How would a Highland Park mother with no experience with firearms come to possess a stolen handgun? And why was there no suicide note? The last person reported to have seen Betsy alive was Sandra Bridewell. The whispers started then, quiet at first, but persistent. In the gossipy, interconnected world of Highland Park, people began to wonder. As always, Sandra moved on. 2 years later, in June 1984, she was in her yard when a handsome, 29-year-old man named Alan Rarig happened to drive by. A former college basketball and football star from Oklahoma, Alan had just moved to Dallas to make his fortune in real estate. He pulled his Ford Bronco over to ask if she knew of any apartments for rent. She didn't, but she offered to help him look. Within weeks, they were inseparable. Alan was smitten. Sandra, then 41, told him she was 36. She charmed him. She introduced him to her children, who began to show up at his office unannounced. Then, in the fall of 1984, she delivered the news that would seal his fate. She was pregnant with his twins. It was a lie of breathtaking audacity. 7 years earlier, Sandra had undergone a hysterectomy. But she had gained some weight, and Alan, in love and with no reason to doubt her, believed the woman who was showering him with affection. In December 1984, feeling the pressure of impending fatherhood, Alan Rarig married Sandra Bridewell. The pregnancy, of course, could not last forever. In February 1985, Sandra made a tearful call to her new husband. She had suffered a miscarriage. Alan was devastated. The foundation of their marriage, built on a lie, began to crumble. Alan soon discovered what Sandra's previous husbands had learned. She had an insatiable appetite for luxury. She pushed him to make more money, to take out a large life insurance policy. He complained to friends that she spent $20,000 a month. By November 1985, just a year into the marriage, they separated. Alan moved in with a friend, convinced he needed to end the relationship. For several weeks, they didn't see each other. Then in early December, Sandra called. She asked Alan to meet her at a storage facility where they had put some of their belongings. He agreed. It was the last time anyone who knew him saw him alive. A short time later, Alan Rarig was found slumped over in his Ford Bronco. He was not in Dallas. The car was parked near the airport in Oklahoma City. He had been shot multiple times in the head and chest. It was clear his body had been driven there after the murder. The Oklahoma City Medical Examiner ruled his death a homicide, and the Oklahoma City police had only one suspect, his estranged wife, Sandra Bridewell. Her behavior in the aftermath was a study in cold detachment. When first questioned by police, she was almost playful, coy, before becoming completely uncooperative, refusing to let investigators speak to her or her daughters. She scrimped on Alan's funeral, choosing the cheapest casket available and convincing friends to pay for the burial. She was late to the service, arriving at the last minute dressed to the nines in a spectacular mink coat. She could afford it. Alan's death had put a $220,000 life insurance policy into her bank account. The Rarig murder, combined with the whispers about Betsy Bagwell and David Stiegel, turned the tide of Dallas society against her. In 1987, magazine published a long, detailed exposé titled The Black Widow. Her reputation was destroyed. Less than a year after Alan's death, Sandra Bridewell packed up her children and fled Dallas for good, relocating to the serene, wealthy community of Belvedere in Marin County, California. She had escaped the gossip of Dallas, but she had not escaped herself. She was a woman who lived on charm and deception, and she brought her skills to a new coast. In California, she cycled through a new round of wealthy men, suckered in by her story of a trust fund she was about to inherit. One man loaned her $23,000. Another gave her over $70,000 from his pension. Neither was ever repaid. But as the stories from Dallas began to follow her, her welcome wore out. By the early 1990s, she had changed her name to Camille Bridewell and left California. She drifted across the country, from a ritzy apartment in Boston paid for by a boyfriend, to Connecticut, to Hawaii. Her cons evolved. She began using the social security numbers of other people, including her own children, to take out credit cards and rack up huge debts, destroying their credit in the process. As she aged and her physical beauty began to fade, her methods shifted. She turned from seduction to religion. She reinvented herself as a missionary, a devout woman who traveled the world working with orphans. In Alabama, she befriended the owners of a motel who, despite her inability to pay, gave her food and money. In Atlanta, using the name Bridwell, she convinced a woman from church to split the rent on an expensive condo, then left her new roommate to pay for everything while she supposedly waited for her trust fund to come through. In 2006, now in her early 60s, she surfaced in North Carolina at a new church, using the name Camille Bowers. That September, she moved in with Sue Mosley, a 77-year-old widow who lived in a $1 million home on the Carolina coast. She struck a deal with Mosley's son, Jim. In exchange for managing the housework, she would receive free room and board. She quickly integrated herself into the community, singing in the church choir and giving talks to women's groups about her missionary work in India and China. Churchgoers, impressed by her stories of service, gave her love offerings. Meanwhile, she was systematically taking over Sue Mosley's life. She collected tax records, rerouted the elderly woman's social security payments, siphoned off mortgage money, and used Mosley's bank account to pay for spa treatments and expensive shoes. She answered the phone, grabbed the mail, and even brought Mosley her medication at night. But Jim Mosley grew suspicious. His mother's new housemate was too possessive, too interfering. In early 2007, he came across a newspaper story from the Dallas Observer Online that chronicled the strange, dark life of a woman named Sandra Bridewell, also known as Camille Powers. The woman in the story was the same woman living in his mother's house. Working with the police, Jim set up a sting. On March 2, 2007, Sandra Camille Powers Bridewell, the Black Widow of Highland Park, was arrested in a cafe in Charlotte, North Carolina. Later that year, she was charged with a raft of federal crimes, including identity theft, fraud, and mail theft. The arrest sparked a new round of interest in the cold case murder of Alan Rarig, and Oklahoma City police reopened the investigation. The FBI joined the probe, looking not just at the Rarig murder, but deep into Sandra's clouded past. In February 2008, Sandra Bridewell, her once raven black hair now gray, shuffled into a federal courtroom in North Carolina. She was 63 years old, dressed in red prison garb, her hands cuffed and her legs in shackles. Sitting in the front row was Gloria Rarig, Alan's mother. For 23 years, she had waited for this moment. She wore a large button with Alan's picture on it. "I just wanted Sandra to see him," she said. Instead of fighting the charges, Sandra Bridewell, the woman who had evaded justice for so long, agreed to a plea deal. She pleaded guilty to one count of identity theft. That September, she was sentenced to 2 years in prison and issued a $250,000 fine. She was ordered to pay a little over $1,600 in restitution to the Mosley family. It was a small, almost insulting measure of justice for the families of the men who had died in her orbit. She had left a trail of ruined lives, grieving families, and unanswered questions, but in the end, she was convicted not as a murderer, but as a common thief. After serving her sentence, she was released, disappearing once more into the fabric of the country. Sandra Bridewell, the fatal beauty, the woman who turned charm into a weapon and tragedy into her trademark, remains a free woman, her darkest secrets buried with the men who loved her. Story 7. The town of Ascot, nestled in the green heart of Berkshire, is a place of manicured lawns and quiet wealth, a world away from the grit and grime of London's sprawling metropolis. It's a town synonymous with horse racing, high society, and a certain kind of English propriety. Here, in a secluded enclave known as Millionaire's Row, life seemed to unfold with a serene, predictable rhythm. It was in this idyllic setting that Joanna Simpson had built her home, a beautiful house that stood as a testament to her success and her vibrant, life-affirming spirit. To the outside world, Joanna, a 46-year-old mother of two, was the picture of a life well lived. She was a successful businesswoman, having run a popular bed and breakfast, and a devoted mother to her two young children. Her friends and family knew her as a warm, generous soul, a woman whose laughter could fill a room and whose loyalty was unwavering. Her husband, Robert Brown, was a man who seemed to have stepped straight out of a glossy magazine advertisement for a life of adventure and success. A captain for British Airways, he piloted Boeing 747s on long-haul flights to glamorous destinations, a job that conferred upon him an air of authority and worldliness. He was handsome, athletic, a 3-time UK trail running champion, and on the surface, the perfect match for the vivacious Joanna. They were a golden couple, living a life of privilege and comfort that most could only dream of. But behind the pristine facade of their Ascot home, a different story was unfolding. A story of control, resentment, and a creeping darkness that would eventually consume them all. Robert Brown was not the man he appeared to be. Beneath the polished veneer of the successful pilot lay a man described by those who knew him best as rude, arrogant, and reserved. He was a man who simmered with a quiet rage, a man who saw the world through a lens of personal grievance and entitlement. Their romance had been a whirlwind. They met, he moved into the house Joanna had purchased with her first husband, and within months they were engaged. He proposed in Hong Kong on Christmas Day 1998, and they were married in a small ceremony in Ascot just 2 months later. But even on their honeymoon in Cape Town, the first cracks began to appear. Joanna called her mother, her voice laced with a dawning sense of dread, and confessed that marrying Robert had been a terrible mistake. She felt trapped, a feeling that only intensified when she discovered she was pregnant just a few months later. Despite her misgivings, Joanna was a woman of fierce determination. She had made her vows, and she was committed to making her marriage work. She poured her energy into her family, raising their 2 children, a boy and a girl, in the beautiful home she had created. But Robert's presence was a constant, unsettling shadow. He was often away on long-haul flights, and Joanna's friends noticed how much more relaxed and happy she was when he was gone. When he was home, the air was thick with tension, his controlling nature casting a pall over the household. The root of much of this tension was financial. Before they married, Joanna's father, a shrewd and protective man, had insisted they sign a prenuptial agreement. It was a standard precaution for a woman of means, designed to protect the assets she brought into the marriage. But for Robert Brown, a man with an inflated sense of his own worth and a deep-seated insecurity, the prenup was a constant, galling reminder of his perceived inferiority. He saw it not as a legal safeguard, but as a personal insult, a declaration that he was not an equal partner in the marriage. It was a grievance he would nurse for years, a seed of resentment that would grow into a poisonous, all-consuming obsession. By 2007, the marriage had begun to seriously unravel. Robert accused Joanna of having an affair, his jealousy a volatile and dangerous force. The strain was becoming unbearable. In February of that year, while on a layover in Hong Kong, he called Joanna, his voice cold and menacing. He told her he was having really dark thoughts of killing her and their children with an axe, thoughts of committing suicide by crashing his plane. The threat, though delivered from thousands of miles away, was terrifyingly real. The breaking point came shortly after. Joanna arrived home late one evening with the children. As Robert put their daughter to bed, she innocently mentioned that they had spent the day with the man Robert suspected Joanna of seeing. The casual remark was a spark to a tinderbox of rage. Robert confronted Joanna in the kitchen, his face a mask of fury. He grabbed her, pinning her against the counter, his arm around her neck. In his other hand, he held a knife, the cold steel pressed against her chest. In that terrifying moment, Joanna knew her marriage was over. She managed to talk him down, her voice calm despite the terror coursing through her. She told him she could no longer be with him, that she had to leave. His response was a chilling ultimatum. She could leave, but she could not take the children. The next day, she fled to the Isle of Man, to the safety of her mother's home. Over the phone, she reiterated her decision to leave him. His reply was a veiled but unmistakable threat. If you tell anyone what happened, it will be the worst for you. The divorce that followed was as acrimonious as the marriage had been toxic. It dragged on for years, a bitter war of attrition fought through lawyers and court filings. Robert's resentment over the prenup festered. His sense of being stitched up and deprived of money, he felt he was owed, becoming the central narrative of his life. He saw himself as the victim, a man wronged by a scheming, rich brat who was using her wealth to destroy him. Then, just 11 days before Joanna's death, a landmark legal ruling sent a shockwave through the world of divorce law. In the case of Radmacher v. Granatino, the UK Supreme Court upheld the validity of a prenuptial agreement, setting a precedent that prenups were, in fact, legally binding. For Joanna, the news was a cause for celebration. She called her stepbrother and a friend, her voice filled with a hopeful excitement. The ruling, she believed, would finally bring her long and painful divorce to a close, validating the agreement she and Robert had signed all those years ago. But her friend felt a chill of premonition. She knew how Robert would react to this news. The ruling would not be a resolution for him. It would be an infuriating, final confirmation that he was going to lose, that he would not get the money he so desperately craved. For Robert Brown, the Radmacher ruling was the final, unbearable insult. His sense of victimhood, his rage at the injustice of it all, coalesced into a single dark resolve. If the law would not give him what he believed was his, he would take his own form of justice. He began to plan. The plan was meticulous, the work of a man who was used to checklists and precision, a pilot who left nothing to chance. He went to a garden center and purchased a heavy-duty plastic storage box, a makeshift coffin. He drove to a secluded, wooded area of Windsor Great Park, a place he knew well from his years of trail running, and there he dug a deep, narrow hole. It was a grave, waiting for its occupant. He placed the plastic box inside, a grotesque time capsule, as he would later claim, for the sham of his marriage. But the hole was not for burying documents, it was for burying a body. Halloween night, 2010. The air was crisp and cold, the streets filled with the cheerful sounds of children trick-or-treating. But in the quiet of Millionaire's Row, a different kind of horror was about to unfold. Robert was due to drop the children back at Joanna's house after a week-long stay with him. Joanna, who had grown increasingly frightened of her estranged husband, had made it a habit to never be alone with him. She always arranged for a friend or family member to be present during these handovers. But on this night, for some reason, her friends were not there. She was alone. Robert arrived, the children running ahead of him into the warmth of the house. At the front door, the final, fatal argument erupted. The details of what was said are lost to the silence of the grave, but the outcome was one of savage, unrestrained violence. As their two children, aged just 10 and 9, cowered in the playroom, Robert Brown took a claw hammer he had hidden in his daughter's school bag and bludgeoned his wife to death. He struck her again and again, at least 14 times, the blows delivered with a heavy force that crushed her skull. She had raised her hands in a desperate, futile attempt to protect herself, the defensive wounds on her arms a silent testament to her final, terrifying moments. The aftermath of the murder was as cold and calculated as the planning that had preceded it. There was no panic, no remorse. There was only the methodical execution of a plan. As his children listened from the playroom, Robert wrapped Joanna's body in plastic sheeting. He went to the master bedroom and removed the CCTV unit from a cupboard, erasing any digital record of his crime. He then carried Joanna's broken body to his car and placed her in the boot. He told his children to get in the car and drove them to the house of his pregnant girlfriend, a British Airways cabin crew member with whom he had started a relationship during the divorce. He dropped them off, his demeanor calm, his actions betraying nothing of the horror he had just unleashed. Then, under the cover of darkness, he drove to Windsor Great Park, to the secluded spot where he had dug the grave. He took Joanna's body from the car and placed it in the plastic box he had buried days earlier. He covered it with earth, burying his wife in the cold, dark ground. He also buried the hammer and the CCTV unit, erasing the tools of his crime. He turned off his mobile phone and drove away, a free man who believed he had committed the perfect murder. The next morning, November 1st, 2010, Robert Brown made a phone call. It was not a confession, but a carefully worded, self-serving statement. He called the police and requested an appointment to discuss a serious domestic incident. The call, with its chillingly vague language, raised immediate concerns for Joanna's welfare. Officers were dispatched to her home in Ascot. They forced entry and were met with a scene of carnage. There was blood everywhere, splattered on the walls, pooled on the floor. But there was no sign of Joanna. When Robert Brown arrived at Maidenhead Police Station, he was immediately arrested on suspicion of murder. The investigators, led by Detective Chief Inspector Steve Tolmie, assumed that because he had handed himself in, he would quickly confess and tell them where to find Joanna's body. They were wrong. For days, he was a stone wall of defiance. In 9 separate interviews, his answer to almost every question was a cold, dismissive no comment. He portrayed himself as the victim, a man driven to the edge by an acrimonious divorce and a vindictive wife. He cited the prenup, his voice filled with a self-pitying rage, as the source of all his troubles. The investigators realized his motive. The breakthrough came on the 3rd day of his interrogation. The police, frustrated by his refusal to cooperate, showed him photographs of the blood-drenched crime scene. The stark, undeniable evidence of his brutality seemed to finally penetrate his wall of denial. After a hushed conversation with his solicitor, his story changed. He told the police that he had lost control and pushed her. He then admitted that he had tried to hide her in a box from the garden center and buried her in Windsor Great Park. On November 4th, he led the police to the secluded woodland near Legoland, Windsor. There, in the cold, damp earth, they found the plastic box. Inside, wrapped in a black bag, was the body of Joanna Simpson. The post-mortem, conducted at Wexham Park Hospital, revealed the full extent of Robert Brown's savagery. Joanna had been beaten with heavy force, to the head at least 14 times with a claw hammer. Any one of the blows could have been fatal. Her body also showed signs of self-defense injuries, a silent testament to her desperate fight for life. She was buried on the Isle of Man, on land belonging to her family, a final return to the place she had once fled to for safety. The trial of Robert Brown began on May 11, 2011, at Reading Crown Court. The prosecution's case seemed overwhelming. They had a confession, a body, and a mountain of evidence pointing to premeditation. Brown had dug the grave in advance. He had brought the murder weapon with him, hidden in his daughter's school bag. He had methodically disposed of the body and the evidence. This was not a spontaneous loss of control. This was a cold, calculated execution. But Robert Brown had a different story to tell. He pleaded not guilty to murder, but guilty to manslaughter on the grounds of diminished responsibility. His defense was built on a controversial psychiatric diagnosis, adjustment disorder. A defense psychiatrist testified that the immense stress of the acrimonious divorce had caused Brown to become mentally and emotionally unstable, impairing his ability to control himself. The killing, they argued, was not a premeditated act of murder, but a tragic consequence of a mental disorder. The prosecution's own forensic psychiatrist, Dr. Philip Joseph, strongly disagreed. Having interviewed Brown in prison, he described him as an intelligent man, a resilient person, somebody who was in control. He argued that it was highly unlikely Brown could have continued to function as a long-haul airline captain, a job that requires immense mental fortitude and the ability to handle stress, if he was suffering from a debilitating mental disorder. In an unusual move for a defendant claiming diminished responsibility, Robert Brown took the stand in his own defense. His testimony was a masterclass in self-pity and victim-blaming. He painted a picture of himself as a man driven to the brink by a scheming, rich brat who was determined to ruin him. He claimed he had been forced to sign the prenup, that Joanna had been controlling and vindictive, that the divorce had been a stitch-up. He offered no real explanation for why he had taken a hammer to Joanna's house that night, or why he had pre-dug a grave. He claimed his memory of the actual killing was a blur, that his next clear recollection was after he had buried her body. His justification for burying the plastic box in advance was a bizarre, self-serving fantasy. He claimed he was going to fill it with court papers and bury the sham of his marriage as a time capsule. After a 10-day trial and nearly 15 hours of deliberation, the jury returned its verdict. It was a verdict that would send shockwaves of disbelief and outrage through the courtroom and across the country. On the charge of murder, the jury found Robert Brown not guilty. They accepted his defense of diminished responsibility and found him guilty only of the lesser charge of manslaughter. For Joanna's family and friends, who had sat through every agonizing day of the trial, listening to the man who had brutally murdered their beloved Joe paint himself as the victim, the verdict was a miscarriage of justice. It was an incomprehensible betrayal, a final, devastating blow. Robert Brown was sentenced to 26 years in prison, 24 for manslaughter and 2 for obstructing a coroner. It was a long sentence, but one that came with a chilling reality. Under the law at the time, he would be eligible for automatic release on license after serving just half his sentence. 13 years. For the savage, premeditated killing of a woman whose only crime was to want to be free of him, he would be a free man in just 13 years. For Joanna's mother, Diana Parks, and her best friend, Hetty Barkwith Nanton, the verdict and the sentence were not an end, but a beginning. They refused to let Robert Brown's narrative of victimhood be the final word on Joanna's life. They resolved to fight, to ensure that he would not be released to potentially harm another woman, to campaign for a justice system that better understood and responded to the insidious reality of domestic abuse. In 2023, as the date of Robert Brown's automatic release loomed, they launched a high-profile campaign to keep him behind bars. They argued that he remained a danger to women, that his lack of remorse and his narcissistic personality made him a significant risk to the public. Their timing was crucial. The law had recently been changed. The Police, Crime, Sentencing and Courts Act of 2022 gave the Justice Secretary new powers to block the automatic release of a prisoner they believed posed a serious risk to the public and refer the case to the parole board for a full review. On October 10, 2023, just weeks before Brown was due to be freed, the Justice Secretary, Alex Chalk, announced that he would use these new powers. Robert Brown's automatic release was blocked. Brown, ever the victim, challenged the decision in the High Court. He claimed the Justice Secretary's intervention was politically motivated, a response to the media campaign against him. But in February 2024, the High Court dismissed his challenge. The judge ruled that there were good grounds for believing that at release, Brown posed a high risk to the public of serious harm and needed a full and proper assessment by the parole board. The case of Joanna Simpson is a story of a life brutally cut short, of a justice system that failed to see a premeditated murder for what it was. But it is also a story of a mother's love and a friend's loyalty, a story of how two women, in the face of unimaginable grief, found the strength to fight for justice, to speak for the voiceless, and to ensure that out of the darkness of one woman's death, a light of hope and change could emerge. Joanna's life was not defined by her death, but by the love she inspired, a love that continues to fuel the fight for a world where no other woman has to suffer her fate.